So this is a tradition we've had at the symposium. We call it our Fireside Chat. We had the fire up for a moment on the screen, but the intent is to have an opportunity for just some discussion among our principal speakers and provide an opportunity for those of you in the audience perhaps to ask some questions that they can all address. And these three individuals are our principal speakers here for the symposium. Starting from my immediate left, George Kurtz is the president of Crowdstrike, and he'll be giving the keynote tomorrow morning. Josh Corman, CTO of Sonatype, is a well-known rabble-rouser and philosopher in security, and he'll be giving the distinguished technical talk this afternoon. And you already heard from Amy Hess just a few moments ago as she gave her keynote this morning. So I've got one or two questions to start off. We're just going to have a conversation amongst ourselves here. And if you have some questions, you can either tweet them to #CERIAS, or you can get up to the microphone and I'll call on you. You can then ask questions that we'll add to the conversation. So, welcome all. Hopefully you have your mics on. One of the aspects that came up in the questions that you were asked and that we often have as we're looking at things, there's debate in the community among people who are working in law enforcement, in government, and in the private sector about what's the appropriate balance between erecting strong defenses to keep people out, to have aggressive reaction when they get in, or to actually take the fight to them before they get there and do a little bit more proactive activities against the criminals, the terrorists, the others who might be doing things. Each of those has its own risks inherent in it from what we do, costs, and difficulties. And so I thought I'd throw that out and let you talk about that, see if you have some particular opinions you want to share, or maybe even argue with each other. I don't know.
I'm happy to start out. Hopefully this is
Now you got to press the button, I think, until it's green.
oh, colorblind. There we go. All right. Is it green?
It's green.
Okay. So first and foremost, thanks for having me, inviting me down. A little bit of a travel nightmare getting here, but I'm here, and certainly that's an exciting topic for me and I'm sure all the other panelists here. When we think about the current landscape today, I think some people have the mindset that you can keep everyone out and you can put all these protections up, but I think a lot of us in security have seen these events unfold either on the private side or law enforcement side. We realize it's inevitable that you just can't keep everyone out, particularly a determined and targeted attacker. So the question becomes, what's the balancing act, as you said, between keeping them out and then once they get in, being able to at least identify them, take an action, either shut them down or watch them or be more proactive. And that's currently hot debate right now. If you look at just over the last week, Microsoft took some action within their own service in Hotmail and being able to identify someone who was stealing intellectual property and then work with law enforcement to take action. There was some debate about that. They had terms of service that allowed them to do that. But I think, as we go forward, it's one of those areas where, the law piece of this needs to catch up with sort of the reality of what's happening. And if you're under attack, what are the things that you're able to do? If someone stole your information and it was sitting on a server and it was just about to be shipped out somewhere, could you go get and retrieve that information? I think it's a hard debate when you look at the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and what people have the ability to do. And I'll tell you a real story, and then I'll kind of yield to my other panelists, but just to kind of put it in perspective, is there was another security researcher who I won't name, but he was working on the high side, and someone had gotten into a pretty large DIB company, stole a bunch of classified information, and then shipped it out to a server. And they had minutes to figure out what to do, and it wasn't like, we can go call someone and wait for hours or days for a subpoena or what have you. So they literally decide, okay, we're just going to go get the data and get it off the server. Now, you can have a debate on whether that was legal or not legal, and there's a bunch of, I'm not the lawyer here, but those are the sort of things that I think will help test the waters in how organizations respond, how they work with law enforcement, and how they get a bit of a hall pass on doing that. And I just don't think it's been tested enough in the court where you can say, okay, if this happens, you're able to do that. I think it's really a case-by-case basis at this point.
Either of you?
I've talked enough so far.
All right, I'll take a stab. While you didn't use these specific words, one of the hot debates we've been embroiled in for years now is the idea of active defense or offensive security. I think the most rational continuum I've seen is called the ARC continuum, or active response continuum. And essentially it's going from pure passive punching bag, where you're just taking a beating and doing nothing, to preemptive strike on the other extreme. And one of my pieces of guidance to the CISOs I work with and have been working with is many of us can't successfully and pervasively apply patches in our environment. What makes us think we're going to have a victory in a toe-to-toe fight with a funded and determined adversary? And escalation is certainly a dynamic. But more broadly, there's quite a few things we could do to do better defense. I think one of the things I'd like to put on the table, I'm certainly going to mention it in my talk later, is the fundamental nature of the cyber domain is skewed towards offense. The very first time I went to Fort Meade, they asked, what does the outside world think of our cyber capabilities? And my answer to the letter was, I assume we're really, really good at offense. We're really, really bad at defense. We take solace in the assumption the same is true for our enemies, but we forget we have so much more to lose. And I think that is gravitating to be that because offense is so easy, the game has turned into who can do the most offense the quickest. And I think what we've done is atrophy that just because offense is easier than current defenses, I haven't yet seen enough. And one of the things I push for through Rugged and through the cavalry and whatnot is more innovative approaches to defense. Deception, I mean, we talked about some common ground on things like deception, fog computing, web labyrinth, honey ports, decoy data. There's a number of techniques emerging and philosophies emerging that say the reason we're losing on defense is we're trying to defend indefensible infrastructure. And we don't have enough control over the operational excellence of our environment either. So there are things that can be done to lay the groundwork for much more effective defense. And a fear I have is our talent pool is being skewed towards pen testing and breaking and offense as opposed to deliberately trying to bring more balance to that natural offensive advantage in the domain.
So, and much like I was addressing in my speech, all of these things are obviously clearly true, is that we can't address this problem like we have addressed prior problems, even in the realm of terrorism in the past, is that we would want to prevent something from happening, but we had the luxury of more time, usually, to be able to investigate and fully understand the planning cycles and the processes that the group, the organization was going through, or the individual was going through. Having that luxury of time plays a key role in our ability to stop the threat and prevent the bad thing from happening. The problem is this is all happening in real time, and much as obviously my co-panelists pointed out, therefore it changes the whole dynamic and how we approach the problem. It becomes a very offensive game as a result, and that's where the key factor for us, the key challenge for us, at least from my agency's perspective, certainly from the government's perspective, is what are the laws, the legal ramifications, the policy restrictions when it comes to that? And how does that preclude us from being able to be agile enough to be able to address that threat? And that's really the key challenge moving forward. How do we get that changed so that we can most effectively address this new type of environment we're in?
There's a strategy that's taught. It was originally developed for fighter pilots, but now it's been taught in most of the military, the OODA loop, the idea of observe, orient, decide, and act. And the concept that was originally developed around dogfighting in planes, and the idea was that if you could exercise that loop faster than your opponent, you'd win. So whoever exercises that loop the slowest loses. And when we look at cyber, the idea of observing, orienting, deciding, and acting often takes weeks to be able to get necessary authorities, get resources in place, where many of the people that we're working against and the organizations we're working against don't follow rules, so they don't have that kind of delay built in. And so do you see our systems ever getting to the point where we'll be able to be competitive on that decision cycle the way they are?
Well, it's a really good point. I hope I don't have to take that slide out of my deck tomorrow.
Okay.
I know.
But you have one too?
I do.
Okay, all right. So these, these concepts are certainly near and dear to our hearts because I do think that's a key component, being able to, get the visibility within an organization from a defensive perspective to understand, that you're being attacked, who the attacker is, potentially what their techniques and tactics are, right? I mean, if you're fighting a Russian, a MiG fighter versus, a North Korean or, someone out of Iran, the tactics are different, right? So how do you understand what that adversary is going to do? First, that they're there, which is a challenge in itself, right? Most companies that we do response for, I mean, it's like 2 years they've been hacked, they don't even know somebody's there. But, our friends at the FBI knock on the door and go, you have a problem. But first understand they're there, then be able to quickly assess whether it's targeted or not, which is a hard problem for most companies because they look at a bunch of malware and they can't sort out whether that's just commodity Zeus or whether that's, a group from China. And then how do they react to it? Is it a just flatten the box, or do we contain it and watch it, or engage and deceive and do that in a very quick fashion? And I think, from a private perspective, the technology is starting to emerge where you're going to get greater visibility to do that. My fear, though, is that kind of the legal piece, and just take a corporation as an example. You have a breach, the first thing somebody does is notify the internal lawyers. Then the lawyers notify the external lawyers, right? So now you have 2 lawyers, internal, external, and everything grinds to a halt. While the security guys are going, well, look, we can just do these things, and in an hour we can get this contained and cleaned up. So I think the technologies will be there to be able to get that visibility. I just don't know how quickly the kind of the bureaucracy and the legal piece will actually be available to support that OODA loop concept.
So I keyed off something you said in your speech. We have disparate rates of change. We also have a lot of information asymmetries and imbalances. One of the things I said about laws, so I'll start with laws, the bad news, and then I'll go to the good news. If you think about the lag time, the multi-stage information asymmetry, the adversaries are usually two years ahead of the researchers. The researchers are 2 years ahead of the product companies. Product companies are 2 years ahead of the buyers. The buyers are 2 years ahead of industry compliance, and industry compliance is 2 years ahead of law. There's absolutely no way that's an effective OODA loop, right? So laws are retrospective. They're trying to summarize what's happened, and what you have is a changing battlefield. There's evolving IT, evolving business priorities, evolving adversary landscape. And what we tend to do is the defender's risk-averse nature is to codify best practices from circa 2003. And those conclusions we came to circa 2003 were based on a 2003 definition of IT, adversary, and business. So when we go to make a legal or policy response, we have to factor in the evolving and dynamic nature. You have sentient, adaptive adversaries. It's one of the pieces that we completely agree on is you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. And I haven't seen enough adversary centricity in risk models. Now on the good news, and I'm definitely going to talk about OODA loops tomorrow, things like DevOps, or the development operations revolution that's kind of replacing and transcending Agile, that's all about lots and lots of tiny batches frequently. It's about fail fast and iterate model. It's also about instrumenting everything. So a lot of the goals of DevOps terrify the average security practitioner that velocity of change is impossible to secure. And yet if you really embrace the spirit of the dogfight, those really tight feedback loops and small but frequent changes are actually, and well-instrumented environments are really, really big boons for our ability to have prompt and agile response.
And that's exactly where we need to be. I mean, I think that, it's far too easy for, at least from a law enforcement perspective, to say, well, the law just hasn't caught up yet. And that's not good enough, because in the meantime, we can say we'll just wait for the law to catch up. Well, right now, we're still operating under the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, CALEA, and from 1994, when really the problem at that time was this, state-of-the-art technology called cell phones. And that was what that problem was meant to address. It expanded in 2003 to include broadband service providers, but everything that's come since then, has not kept up, and the law has not kept up. And so as a result, now we're caught in this. Okay, that's clearly not going to work when it comes to finding that attribution in order to hold the perpetrator, to justice, but also to prevent another attack from occurring. How do we do that? How do we be able to protect our systems better under the law, with the civil liberties concerns, the privacy concerns, to make sure that the government isn't overreaching outside of those parameters that we're confined to work within?
So you mentioned that you had the group at Quantico and in West Virginia who are looking ahead at future threats. And Josh, as you mentioned, the researchers are 2 years, 4 years ahead of where we are. But if we look at what's constrained by law, our legislators still think of the internet as a system of tubes, or some did, but that's not far off. I heard an instance about a month ago where somebody who's going to negotiate an internet trade treaty was heard asking a member of his staff to explain what an ISP was. So we have a real lag of understanding at the level of the people who make the regulations and the laws that your agents are expected to follow, that we as operating in the field are expected to follow in what we do. How do we cope with that in any meaningful way?
Well, that's really the challenge, and I think one of the things that I like to talk to companies about, particularly on a breach response, is build the relationship. And I know Amy talked about this, but I like to say adopt an FBI agent, if you will, right? Build a relationship in advance, because you don't want to get the knock on the door. And we have a couple of FBI executives on our team and that used to work with Amy, and traditionally they would knock on a door and company would be just dumbfounded that their data was somewhere on the internet. So, adopt an FBI agent in advance of something bad happening. And I think it's really important then to build that relationship in advance, so that when something happens, I think you get most done by having a personal relationship in anything. And the laws are not going to catch up, but in a particular case, if you're working with law enforcement, they know you're trying to do the right thing. When your data is floating out there and you're trying to contain it, I think there's going to be a lot more cooperation in helping you deal with that in whatever manner or action that you take, as opposed to not having a relationship. And that is the way I think we're going to solve it between now and when the laws catch up. And I'll tell you a true story on, in this particular, for this particular story. I was at the Pentagon and I had mentioned this story to a very high-ranking official, and they said, well, the one I told earlier, did they get the data? And I said, yeah, they got the data. And he goes, yeah, good. And he was very excited that they actually took the action to get the data. So I think, there's a lot of folks who are fighting this battle and, fighting a common adversary that want to see us collectively win, and I think they're willing to work with us, and Amy can comment, within the balance of kind of the existing laws, even though we know they're antiquated. But it's having that relationship in advance and working with them in a partnership, as opposed to, sort of going off the reservation, doing things that are not necessarily, in line with that spirit of cooperation.
Yeah, I totally agree that the relationships and the people matter. Whoever coined people, process, and technology was brilliant to put people first and technology last, but we're good little crack addicts that go straight for tech. One of the things shiny, exactly. One of the things, though, that that's really about how do you make more optimal law enforcement. You called me a rebel rouser or rabble rouser. At DEF CON last year, I tried to rabble rouse the hacker community, the white hats, maybe some shades of gray in there as well. And what we basically said is we've looked high and low for the adults in the room on cyber literacy and public policy. So for new laws, and what we found is that the cavalry isn't coming. There are no more experts on cybersecurity than they are stem cell research or fracking or any highly technical discipline. So we're in the process of forming either a 501c3 or a 501c6 to be a technically literate voice of reason, a non-commercial voice of the profession to engage as an ambassador to mainstream media, industry, and public policy. So I've already been walking the Hill quite a bit this spring, or winter, I guess, but since January, because really it falls to us. If we're expecting they're just going to figure out cyber one day, what we really need to find is our best and brightest and our best communicators that can get outside of the echo chamber and bring the right messages with the right phrasing and metaphor to the right decision makers. And that is stumbling and fumbling. But I think the way you get in front of how do you better enforce bad laws is raise the technical literacy for the average citizen and for the average policymaker.
I think that's going to take years, though. I mean, I've spoken to some senators, and you can literally see the packets traverse, their head as you talk about cyber. And there's others who totally get it, right? So that's a long road to hoe as well.
And not intended to be cynical, but I've been working in policy and this for quite some time. Unless they come asking for the information, the only way you get on the agenda is if you have money. And so a nonprofit is not necessarily going to get you where you need to go.
Yeah, that's what we're struggling
But that may
with.
be overly cynical, but that has been the experience. If someone from the FBI or from CSIPs or some of the other organizations come and ask, yes, we want to know who they can go to ask. Adopting some agents maybe not as a bad idea. You have some orphan agents we can...
Absolutely, we've got plenty up for adoption currently. I think that certainly the key on this point of how do we educate the legislators? How do we how do we do that? And we do a lot of obviously interaction on the Hill. Usually because a particular legislator has a question about whether they think that we overstepped on something, or how does this work, or the perception is something that they're concerned about. And what I've found particularly challenging, that I think kind of puts it in a context that isn't readily expected, is that when we go to the Hill, when I've gone there and tried to explain that our laws are not keeping up with technology, the instant response is well, give us examples. And it sounds simple, is that, give us examples of where you have a court order and you weren't able to get what you wanted because the laws have not kept up with technology. So give us an example of that. And we go back out and we will canvass all of our field offices. And what we found, this is an interesting dynamic, agents don't ask for things that they don't think they're going to get. And as a result, I have nothing. I get 0 examples because they're not asking for those things. They don't think they're going to get them, so why bother to write up an entire affidavit to support a court order and get not only multiple levels of management to sign off on it, but also obviously the judge, in order to effectuate a court order that you're not going to get it anyway. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, so then I go back and the next conversation is, where's the examples? Well, then clearly you don't have a problem.
Right.
There's a nice insight here to springboard off of, which is, so the cavalry really chose as its focus because they don't care unless they're asking. We've chose public safety issues, so hacking of cars, medical devices, home electronics, and the Internet of Things, and public infrastructure. They do care about those things. And one of the things we've gone to the FDA for, the Food and Drug Administration, for example, is several researchers have hacked their insulin pumps, their subdural pacemakers, and defibrillators. It's demonstrable, and the FDA keeps saying, well, there's been no documented deaths yet. And there's quite a few of those kinds of things. Similarly, there's been some very suspicious car accidents. And they're saying, well, there's no proof that it was malfeasance or hacking involved. So here's a lesson to this type of a community. Maybe the laws should be encouraging or scaffolding, and maybe the research community should be putting in forensically sound logging and evidence collection on medical devices and in cars. We have black boxes in airliners because it enables someone like the NTSB to learn from mistakes and enhance the security over time. Now that software is in cars and in medical devices, it has the same potential to do harm on a much broader scale. So perhaps legislation, instead of trying to codify PCI, which doesn't even work for its intended purpose, perhaps the legal suggestion should be to enable the evidentiary collection or the forensically sound capture on these things such that we can learn from and make smarter risk decisions going forward.
Well, that brings about, though, a different concern That is true with a lot of data collection and the big data concerns and otherwise, that having all of this information now allows greater violation of privacy. And two concerns there. There's certainly the organizations that collect it, using it for marketing and using it to draw inferences that we may not like, particularly when they're wrong, or maybe when they're right, I don't know. But it's also the case that now that information is available to be leaked, to be stolen, to be taken under cases of NSLs or warrants, and that is not information that was available before, and so that concerns people. Is there a balance here from an investigative standpoint as to what should be available? I don't know that there's an answer to this. Certainly, we just saw the president proposing some legislation to limit cell phone record retention for this very same reason. But is there anything that we can do as a community to try to help move this discussion forward to get a good level of collection, but at the same time be privacy preserving to a reasonable extent? It's all up to you, George.
Raise your hand if you think we're going to stop collecting more and more data every year than last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the point. It's, you know, it was painful after 9/11 to go through all of the stuff at the airport. We all got used to it, and I think, you know, at some point we have to go, okay, this level of data and collection is here to stay, and it's more about how we balance it, and you know, given the last year or so when the events transpired with, you know, Snowden and WikiLeaks and et cetera, you know, I think it's really just brought the debate to the forefront of, okay, we have to do collection, there's privacy concerns, and how do we do it in a balanced and responsible way? I don't have the answer for that. You know, I'm sure Amy might have some thoughts on it, but it's not going away, as Josh said, so we just need to figure out how to live with it and do it in a way that we're comfortable that, you know, our privacy is not being violated. And at the same time, you know, there are some good things that come out of the data collection. The coordination that Amy talked about of being able to look at malware across various organizations and triangulate what's happening and help organizations when they see an attack, that's a good thing. But at the same time, you know, people don't want all of their information violated. So I don't really have a great answer other than...
I think the beginning of your answer to that was illustrative in a way when you said we all got used to TSA. Well, you know, that's a problem because really TSA is not very effective. It's terribly annoying. It's a huge waste of money, and yet we've all come to accept it and kind of go, oh, well, we've got to do it.
We're numb to it, right?
Yeah, and that's part of the problem is that the incrementalism of collecting our information, of eroding some of the privacies, we get numb to that. And the question is, how much of that should we be allowing to go forward?
As the actual philosopher on the panel, this is a long overdue debate. In fact, what was very disappointing to me is the events of the Snowden gate could have catalyzed a really big social contract reboot. We could have said, in a hyper-connected reality, here's the state of nature. Like, you can't get mad at gravity. Gravity just exists. You have to factor for it. So if the pervasive surveillance and collection and even volunteering of information through things like Facebook, I mean, some believe privacy's essentially dead. I guess I should channel my inner Dan Gear real quick. Dan's so brilliant, but not enough people hear him. He basically said that if you think of privacy as two things, one is the ability to be observed. It's like, let that one go, it's gone. You know, we're infinitely observable. The other one is the persistent ability to deny who you are or obfuscate who you are. He said that one's gonna be really hard. So if you think, you know, the ability to be observed or to deny it was you, are you really two value levers? It's just a different way of framing privacy. He's essentially saying it's gone. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but if you want to reboot the social contract and say what's the balance we want to see between an NSA charter and privacy, that conversation hasn't yet happened. Instead, when you see South by Southwest, it was a debate on crypto or using SSL everywhere. So we haven't really yet capitalized on this catalyst or this opportunity to reboot that, and I think we should. But just as a really simple example, this is why we need more literacy. One of the key triggers for the cavalry formation was when I was at the fort, and this was not classified. One of the assertions was, well, couldn't we stop the hemorrhage of intellectual property from the US economy to China if we simply empowered the ISPs to do deep packet inspection and run signature antivirus. And I had assembled 5 of the world's best security researchers, and simultaneously all 6 of our jaws hit the table. And we went white, and we said, with all respect, who told you that? And he said, well, we have a council of the CTOs of the various antivirus companies, and that was their #1 suggestion. And I said,
That wasn't me, but
if you had said it, we wouldn't be friends anymore. It's essentially what we said is, with all respect, the efficacy of signature antivirus against espionage is 0. And I want you to start framing things in terms of literacy, which is, this will be perceived by anonymous and chaotic actors and a younger demographic as an infringement on 4th Amendment. That's the cost, and maybe we could debate if that cost should be worth the benefit. But the benefits is essentially 0. So that's a really bad trade. Now notice I didn't say we shouldn't have that cost-benefit conversation and rebalancing. But my bigger fear is that they're doing it without facts, or they're doing it with only a commercially vested set of facts. So that is another punctuation for why we need to have a lot more literacy, cyber literacy. I said cyber, but I want to drink scotch with you later, so that's okay.
We'll figure a way around that.
Yeah.
Any comments to this?
So part of the whole discussion, I think, centers on has been this conversation about trade-offs, and again, the risk versus benefit. But part of the challenge for us, I think, when you go from a reactive law enforcement model to a preventive law enforcement model, is you don't have that smoking gun. You can't say that this is the event, this is what happened, and this is why it's a good idea that we do X, Y, and Z. Instead, what you're trying to do is prove a negative, that this thing didn't happen because we were able to do X, Y, and Z. And that's a much different type of dynamic that brings in to the equation, because some people may look at that and say, well, how do you know that was going to happen? Because all these indicators were such that it looked like it might happen, but it still might not have happened. If I have a car full of guys that are circling a bank and they have guns, does it mean that they're really going to rob the bank? And at what point does the FBI need to step in before that happens? So if we don't step in, however, and they do go into the bank and end up killing somebody, then obviously that's a bad day for us. But it brings up a lot of the discussions on an oversimplified method of what we're having here today, because how far are we willing to go as a society with that trade-off, that risk versus benefit, in order to have those type of predictive, proactive models of law enforcement rather than the reactive model?
There's a rather interesting argument that's been made by some that if we are worried about the erosion of privacy, that actually the way to deal with this need for information, is to actually increase the transparency and the oversight. And that is where some of the difficulties may be occurring, is that we don't actually have enough insight as to how the information is being used, who's using it, oversight into how that's being done. And the select committee that was looking at the 215-703 collections, for instance, for the president, that was one of the things they brought out. That's been an ongoing criticism of the national security letter use, as another example, for those of you who are following in the audience. But that greater transparency also means a greater insight into the methods that are used, and that could therefore erode some of the effectiveness of the methods.
Just real briefly, I mean, what you're hitting on is a first principle, right? So one of our first principles is transparency in the way we conduct it. And what I found striking I don't know if people have seen it, but Snowden also did a TED Talk, and it was followed up by a response from Rick Leggett of NSA, which was a really nice pairing to watch back to back, because in my experience working with the intelligence community, these are not evil people. They have first principles that guide their actions. It's the sequence of which one wins in a tie, which is where the debate needs to happen. And what we're talking about is crypto or SSL or mass collection, instead of saying, here are our first principles, here's the prioritization of those first principles, and that would govern what the TSA does versus what national security letters look like versus a new charter for the NSA, if that's what we want to do. But this is less about technology and more about our first principles.
Just to follow on, there's a thread there that is adjacent to what we're talking about, but related. You talked about this, you want transparency in the fact that the source and methods are sometimes classified, right? So people fall back on that. And I think that's one of those, it's an easy crutch to fall back on, to say, well, we can't give that to you because it's classified in the source and methods. And I think that's one of the things that frustrates me about the government in terms of, when someone does knock on the door, company says, okay, well, tell me what happened, who is it, what should I do? And they sort of get that we can't tell you because it's all, source and methods. And it's like saying, you've got a condition that you're going to die in a month, but we can't tell you what it is. It's like, okay, what do I do now? So I think that's one of the areas.
Write a will.
Yeah. But I think that's one of the areas when we think about transparency. I mean, again, it's kind of related to what you're talking about, but what I would love to see more of is, the indicators themselves, when we talk about them, we have the indicators. Lots of people have the indicators, and a lot of times the indicators aren't given out because of source and methods, and I'd love to see the government loosen up a little bit more to be able to share those indicators, because I just think that the source and methods in that classification is a bit of a crutch.
I actually chose the examples, and I'll expand on this because then I'd like you to comment on this, Amy. The transparency, the oversight into things is not only because of classified issues, but for instance, in a law enforcement situation, they investigate a number of possible things, a number of suspects who really have nothing to do with the case. And that information is kept confidential to protect those individuals who aren't guilty of something. It's not simply a matter of protecting sources and methods, but respecting privacy as part of what they do. It's very difficult, I would think, to actually try to present all of that in a transparent way and yet preserve that kind of privacy for those individuals who are victims of crimes or who are mistakenly suspect or who are contributing information. Yeah, do you have anything to add to that conversation?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, I mean, and clearly that's the challenge for us, is that we need to do a better job of sharing information and not always default to we can't tell you. At the same time, there are a lot of things going behind the we can't tell you default position, because there are obviously the privacy concerns, not the least of which are a piece of that. The sources and methods piece, it depends on the nature of the investigation or the nature of what we're talking about. But you think of it in terms, in the context of so the NSLs, for example. It's one thing to say, this is how many NSLs we publish. It's a whole other thing for me to say, and this is who they were on, and these are the telephone numbers, and this is who we had under investigation, because we weren't sure when we heard that there was a plot to blow up a building on campus. Then we had to look at where that phone number, basically all the hops that phone number took, and maybe there were multiple people there that weren't the right person, but in that course of investigation, we had to put that net out there first and then narrow it down. So is it a valid argument then to say that that information should be transparent, or any fraction of that information should be transparent? That we, for example, even if we don't disclose the names or the telephone numbers, perhaps that we only looked at people on campus that last name began with an M. And that's the privacy. I'm oversimplifying completely, but that's the part of the issue that we're dealing with, as well as the law enforcement sensitive protections of if we disclose exactly how we went about doing something, does that give a roadmap, a blueprint to the next person who then will want to take steps to avoid those things?
Just one sentence. State the obvious. Secrets are necessary. And a fear in this debate is we're going to err so much on transparency, we're going to forget that there's a vital, necessary role for secrecy.
Yeah, there is a balance there that is constantly changing. And just as a brief, for those of you in the audience, we've been saying NSL. If that isn't immediately a register term for you, it means National Security Letter. And you can look that up with Google or Bing or otherwise if you need further explanation.
Ask me if I've ever gotten one. I can't tell you.
Okay. I can say I haven't gotten one yet. So after one of these meetings, who knows? We'll go to the mic.
I'm interested in what you think.
You have to hit the button there. That's on the side.
There we go.
Thank you.
I'm interested in what you think will break the ice to be able to start collecting data, sharing it, solve some of these policy issues. Because when you bring up the TSA question, the thing that occurs to me is nobody would accept the TSA rules that we have right now until you had that 9/11 event, when the population could see themselves, put themselves on one of those planes. So do you need a cyber Pearl Harbor to
Let's not use that term.
actually implement this? And the best you can do is put first principles, policies in place, waiting for it?
That's exactly what I think we need to get in front of that problem so that doesn't happen. But that brings up this whole predictive, preventive model that we're talking about, where if we don't have an event, which we don't want to have that type of event, then how do we ensure that that type of event doesn't happen? But the policies and the principles and the laws that surround that haven't kept up yet. They aren't there yet, and we need to figure out how to communicate something where it's very easy for legislators to see that something happened and we need to fix it as a result of something happening in a reactive mode instead of a proactive mode.
But nobody wants to take the risk of sharing until there's a greater risk of not sharing evident to them. I mean, right there.
It's also a tragedy of the
impacted
commons
them
problem. I mean, the individual cost benefit is different than the collective cost benefit
Right.
as
And I
well.
can get that across.
Yeah. Now, I will never repeat the words you just said because I'll lose my street cred, but in terms of public safety things, we do believe that the analogy we've used is if you think of pollution law, nothing changed even though it was a pervasive problem until the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught on fire and stayed on fire. Now, it's our belief that that cyber Cuyahoga River moment, which is less polarizing, is coming. And one of the reasons we've started this public policy discussion on safety is that typically when you have a 9/11 moment or you have a Cuyahoga River moment, you have a bad knee-jerk response. And the reason to start the debate in scaffolding now is have a ready-to-go, thoughtful, planful, intelligent response. If we wait for that moment, we will have another bad law or a bad policy change. If you can do some analysis in advance, then when that moment comes, you have a ready-to-go framework to be put into place.
Just to comment on that, though, but if you just take a look at last year, I mean, it was the year of the breach, right? I mean, Target is a huge watershed event, right? I mean, it's another of many that have happened and will continue to happen. But if you just look at that as an example, I mean, the Secret Service sat on, the malware for, 2-3 weeks before the researchers even had it. There's a few people that had it, but it was actually very difficult to get a hold of that. And that's like 3 weeks of just pain, not knowing what other retail organizations were hit, et cetera. So, I mean, I think there's a need for kind of managing the situation, but the comment was really about sharing that information. And again, that was a situation where the government actually had it. And, there are certainly companies and researchers and folks in the industry who they work with. It would have been, a lot easier and more effective to be able to get that out sooner than later than just kind of wait for, weeks before that actually came to light.
Well, part of the problem is you look at the realm that we're talking about here with computing, information technology, combinations of policy and law and other issues, and yet the population that votes, the population that's affected that is going to drive any change, 25% of them believe that the sun revolves around the earth, that more of them can name all the members of the Kardashian family than any of their elected representatives. This may not describe you in the audience, I hope, but the vast population of people out there are sort of willfully ignorant. And when it comes to things like this where we're talking about, it's equivalent to magic, which, by the way, 43% of the population believes in astrology. So maybe we have to wait for the planets to align and the rivers to catch fire before this happens.
We can be smarter for them.
If they'll let us. There is a problem there. For a long time, it used to be that we could say these are the studied individuals at the universities and the government agencies. You can trust their decisions. And more and more people are not doing that. They're distrusting those organizations, either because they've been told they should distrust those organizations, Even though the evidence is there. Another example is that the AAAS, just at one of the meetings, was talking about climate change. 97% of all scientists are convinced climate change is real. And yet you go talk to the person on the street, and because of the pounding of the information from some of the media, some of the moneyed interests, they think it's a controversial issue, that it's not settled, even though it's a settled fact for all the scientists. So we have some very interesting problems here in terms of communication of risk and trust and authority that is in addition to understanding the problems.
I'm going to file that under gravity again in pervasive surveillance. Like, it's one of those things I can't change, but I can factor for in my chosen response. I wish it weren't so.
May I be recognized because...
I recognize you, Victor, so...
because what I wanted to ask, you may sort of slip away from
Can
that.
you pull the mic down and talk?
From that topic. What, I'm not tall enough for you? I was thinking, and I will eventually in 20, 30 minutes get to the question. We're all very good about lamenting the situation, and even at these symposiums, symposia, we have been lamenting pretty much the same situation for 15 years. But can we turn the tables? You mentioned, Gene, before, you didn't want to be cynical. That's news to me. About how money talks. We are definitely not talking to the legislators in the language they understand. Lamenting that they are not technically educated is futile, because if they were, they would do something useful. So there is a self-selection in that. By the way, the idea of electing all the Kardashians into Congress, it's a very good idea, because the public will watch the Congress much more closely then. What can be done according to the political real situation? The question is, are the interests of high-tech companies, all companies that protect their intellectual property, similar enough for those companies to form a powerful lobby, not to pay insurance fees or whatever, which is passive, but actually pool the same money into an organization which will have an impressive office on K Street, and will have the budget for donating money to the senators and congressmen's election campaigns, and having personal relations with enough reporters to ring alarm all the time about the situation. The alternative, which Josh, I'm sure, will welcome, that is forming a white disaster arrangement organization, is probably less desirable. Is there any attempt, that's the question, to lobby on behalf of all of those interests? Are they identical enough for people to do it together, for the competitors in the industries to pool their resources into one high-tech technological cyber lobby?
There are groups that do that. I can tell you, I work with some groups in DC that do represent high-tech industry, but they are outspent and competed by organizations such as the Better Business Bureau and others that represent a much larger group of companies. The entertainment companies are the biggest heavyweights because of intellectual property protection issues. They spend vastly more money than are likely to be spent by the high-tech companies. How that will play out in the longer term is a whole different issue.
Well, my question is, why not all the organizations, intellectual property, entertainment, whatever, do it together in one powerful lobby?
They're not aligned enough to do that.
Well, so we have 2 days, let's align them. Thank you.
Any of you want to respond to that as well?
I mean, this is exactly what we're exploring. I mean, when I said C3, educational foundation. A C6 is an industry or professional organization. A C3 can't lobby. A C6 can do a little bit of lobbying. I didn't say C4, and I didn't say PAC, or Political Action Committee, because those get partisan really quickly, and we wanted to avoid that. But I'm still naive enough, and I'm self-admitting that, and I'm tenacious enough and stubborn enough, as the rabble-rouser I was accused of being correctly. We are trying to get really solid, good arguments and cases and rubrics in front of them, and so far it hasn't required a lot of money. Doesn't mean it couldn't get reversed by someone who doesn't like it, but for example, I posed a simple rubric, and I was told instantaneously by a Democratic senator, well, the Chamber of Commerce will never stand for that. And they were probably right. And yet a different group loved my argument so much, they said, you really should get in front of the Chamber of Commerce, because I don't think they're thinking about this correctly. And I think that the way you tackle these Gordian knots is you find out what their current belief structure is, and you present more facts. Now, it doesn't necessarily eliminate the Gordian knot, but it may loosen it enough for something to get through. And I proposed a very common sense, simple addition to the Defense Authorization Act, and I think it's pretty much going to get in. It didn't take money. It didn't take multiple visits. I talked to the guy who writes it. I made a good argument, and he's like, it makes perfect sense to me. It was a complete opposite of what I've been led to believe. I'm not saying that's always going to happen. I started this saying I'm naive. But I think the act of trying and building those muscles and failing fast and iterating is the hacker way, and we need some white hat hackers to start trying as well.
Let me take a little bit of a different cut on this, and I think one of the failings that we have in the security community is we like to talk about registry settings and
Yes.
weird file names and downloader XYZ, and we get excited, but business people don't understand that. What they understand is time, money, and going to jail. Those are kind of the main drivers of business, right? If you can save time or money or avoid going to jail, then you get somebody's attention. So there is a little bit of good news, kind of post, the year of the breach. We're starting to see more engagement from boards of directors, and they're starting to ask the question, what does this mean for us? Could we be another target? Do we have adversaries in our network? What's been stolen? Traditionally, they've asked the CIO, and the CIO said, don't worry, boss, we've got a firewall, we've got AV, we've got enough, we're covered, right? That's not the right answer. So we're actually seeing, again, true story, we saw a board engage their own internal counsel to come visit with us to go understand their security, because they didn't really get the right answer from their own internal IT people. So there's more of a recognition now that security is important at the board level. That's a good thing. So where I'm going with this is, I think, you can band together all of the security folks, and there's some big players in the industry, and we're still not going to have as much power as take the Fortune 100, right? Mm-hmm. When you start to see the Targets of the world, the Walmarts of the world, the Exxons of the world, the Halliburtons of the world, et cetera, when they start to go, wait a minute, we have a huge problem here, we need to get somebody's attention, I think they can do that, and it's at the executive level, and it's in sort of that time, money, and intellectual property theft. And I hope that they're now getting more educated. But these are, as an industry and as a population, should say, we still have a problem picking good passwords. So to get some of the concepts that we're talking about at the board level ingrained and have them understand it is a difficult task. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I think that's the group that can actually go into Washington and make a change.
Okay. I've got one question that came in online, and actually two that are related, and I'm going to try to combine them here, and direct to Amy to start with here. A lot of what goes on in cyber is very asymmetric. Small number of people can have a very big effect. But we're beginning to see some things that are quasi-nation state related, almost military in a way. The Syrian Electronic Army, as an example, was the one that was mentioned here, where you have a group that are pursuing a nationalistic kind of behavior, and what they're doing is attacking domestically. How do we deconflict that kind of activity as being a law enforcement versus a military kind of activity? How do we resource that, and how do we appropriately respond to that kind of thing? That may increase with time as international relations become a little bit more uncertain. We may actually see some behavior like this going on from Russia or from Ukraine, directed into the U.S. So how do we cope with these kinds of situations?
That's exactly what we've been talking about here, is that, as this nature of this threat evolves, is that how do you go about using, again, current laws, policies, in order to address these issues? The problem there is that, it's much like I equate it to the issues with the domestic terrorism groups, right? Is that, in the past, you have to be able to distinguish between, again, what are First Amendment protected rights versus actual damage, actual violations of U.S. laws. And moreover, if it's coming from outside of the U.S., what authority do we have to be able to hold that perpetrator to justice if that isn't a violation in that particular country where it originated? And at the same time, can we use then civil capacities to pursue those types of activities? But part of the problem is that I think how we go about addressing that goes right back to the perception issue. And I just wanted to touch on this real quick, if I could, kind of come back to that, is this communication issue that we've been talking about is really a key piece of what we've been discussing. What we've been talking about here is we have I think collectively, a communication problem. And whether it's my ability to explain the impacts of budget cuts to the agent on the street, because in very endearing terms, I tell my folks in my branch that you've got to ungeek the language. You've got to be able to explain it in terms that the agent understands what's going to be impacted, what they won't be able to get if we don't have that thing. At the same time, on the Hill, we've got to be able to communicate, to be able to do the same thing. What's going to be the impact if we don't change this law, if we don't change this policy? This is what's going to happen in terms they can understand as well. But how we go about addressing groups versus individual actors is much like how we've addressed this in the past. First of all, how do you work within the confines, clearly, of the Constitution? But now, with the international community, how do you develop those relationships so that even if it's not a violation there, that they would be able to work with us as well? But in this particular capacity, really it comes down to what has been damaged, and then is it enough, the risk versus benefit, for us to go after these particular groups?
So when you first invited me, I was the Director of Security Intelligence for Akamai. So we had purview of the internet backbone. And there's an article that almost no one read that I want everyone in this room to read. In Vanity Fair, Michael Joseph Gross. It came out almost the exact same day, the exact same day that the Snowden case broke, so no one read it. But essentially it does a survey of all the Middle Eastern attacks and all the Middle Eastern malware from Stuxnet and Flamer and Gauss and Syrian Electronic Army and Al-Qasim Freedom Fighters. In my role at Akamai, what we could see instantaneously was while it looked like the Al-Qasim Freedom Fighters attack on banks were spontaneous protest like anonymous, they sure smelled like a Russian TTP or a tactic, technique, and procedure. And the Syrian Electronic Army is a very similar thing. Syrian motive, Russian TTP. Hezbollah motive, Russian TTP. So people are talking about maybe eventually Russia will start doing this too. I think they've been doing it all along. Not necessarily directly, but at least being trained by someone from RBN or Eastern European tactics, settings, and procedures, because from the data flow, it was not spontaneous at all. It was an instant on square function, really obvious set of traffic that looked exactly like an attack a year prior by a Russian crime syndicate. So while we can talk about jurisdictional things, you know what the answer was to that? It's really easy to stop DDoS attack. So there was an existing countermeasure while we're still trying to admire the problem of the international entanglement and attribution. But while some people were trying to get hard attribution of, is this a Russian thing or is this a Middle Eastern thing, there were available countermeasures to stop it. So we have to have both conversations. I just don't want to admire the problem on the really, really hard parts when there's practical steps that can be taken.
Well, we've about reached the end of our time here. I'd like to give each of you a minute for any summary statement you'd like to make about any of this material.
Well, I guess I'll state the obvious. It's a hard problem. I think the hardest piece of it is not necessarily the technology. I think it's the people component, and it's the education of business and the government as well. And it's going to take time to move the ball forward. From my perspective, if I can do a small part in helping educate people and have a debate, that's my role in pushing the ball forward. But I think collectively, we all have to kind of band together and start asking some hard questions on, again, what's being collected, how do we actually get good information, how do we share it, and how do we get people who are not necessarily in the security field to listen. And I guess my last sort of takeaway is, don't assume that the folks that you're dealing with know as much as you from a security perspective. And again, to try to put it in terms that they really understand, in terms of time and money and compliance. And when we start to talk to the legislators, when there's a huge event that happens and you put it in terms of job loss or plant closing or things that they get, you'll start to get some more attention. So I know we all love this technology and the shiny thing when we get drawn into it. But there's a world around us that exists that doesn't really know this magic and black art that we do, and we need to keep that in mind when we're trying to move our goals forward and just educate people who are not in the trenches every day.
One of the reasons I'm from a distance very fond of CERIAS is it's from its inception been a multidisciplinary approach, and that is exactly the key going forward. It may be about expressing some of those disciplines more than we have in the past, but this is the exact right attitude. Some of the most impactful people on the direction and conversation in the echo chamber in the cybersecurity community have been what I call boundary spanners, right? They're people who can exist and be respected in more than one discipline. And what I really think is lacking right now is that, you touched on communication, but I want to see more psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, policy folk, and economists in the mix, because this is not, to riff off the adversary problem, it's not a malware problem, it's an adversary problem. We have an incentive problem. So we're incentivizing the wrong things in the free market, in the industry, in the research community. So my takeaway from a lot of this conversation is it's the soft skills and the human factors that need a lot more attention. So when we do get the attention of a policymaker, it can't be about crypto. It's going to have to be, why does this matter, right? The what and the how never come until you can get them on the why. So we have to be, for the next 12 months, focus on why. Then we have a rich body of knowledge we can draw from to answer what and how we do it.
And finally, I would just say that the key question here is we need to collectively determine, what are we trying to accomplish? What do we want to accomplish? What's the goal? What role are we comfortable with the government playing in this field? Recognizing, again, the trade-offs there in order to hold people accountable, in order to ensure that, of course, they're held accountable whether criminally or civilly. Are we willing how far are we willing to go in order to enable that to happen? And then finally, how much information sharing are we comfortable with? How much are we willing to share as a society when it comes to these types of attacks for a variety of reasons, whether it's with the government, whether it's with industry, whether it's in the community at large? How much information are we comfortable with in revealing again, any privacy concerns, any proprietary concerns we might have. And these are all obviously the subjects of the debate. As was just mentioned, it's rarely a technology problem. It's all the things that surround all the things we've talked about here today, the policy, the legal, the privacy impacts, and certainly the impacts on the community at large.
So I think we have marching orders from this panel that have come out from here. We know that we have to do a better job de-geeking ourselves and explaining what we do. We need to do a better job of communicating on levels and issues that are different from the technology, that the technology doesn't justify some of the steps, but in fact we have to look at the impact on human beings and the organizations that they work in. We have to spend a better portion of our time thinking about how to affect policymakers, improve the communication, decide what it is we want to do, adopt an FBI agent, and with that,
and a senator.
Let me note that Josh will be speaking this afternoon. George will be speaking tomorrow. We have some other events planned. We're going to take a brief break here for a few minutes, and then we're going to go into our poster session to tell you about our posters that are going to be available this afternoon. But first, join me in thanking our panel for the time this morning.